So, we are back after like 5 weeks of no Vivas. Here we are, guys. We're back again. So, week 16, the question is, how did the Viking invasions, how did they reshape Europe? So, although history tends to focus on the destructive pillaging and invasions of the Vikings as their only impact on Europe, the Vikings' innovative strategies and colonization of Europe shifted the political gravity from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. So the three ways that it did this was, firstly, the Viking invasions reshaped Europe because they ended the Carolingian domination of Europe. And then second, they reshaped the European map by establishing and settling new kingdoms. And then third, they transformed culture by transmitting the Viking culture through technological innovation, their literature, and through the trade that they did. So, firstly, let's get into how the Vikings made the decline of the Carolingians. So, if we want to look back at the Carolingian dynasty and Renaissance, we remember that it started with Charles the Hammer and kind of came down the line to Charlemagne, who started the Carolingian Renaissance in 800. But actually, Charlemagne's and this Carolingian dynasty didn't last that long. It was over pretty shortly, and it didn't withhold against Viking invasions for very long. Which is really interesting because if we think about like Rome and some other really big empires, they were able to hold together for a really long time, even though they had their one weakness, which was that they were huge and hard to control. But Carolingians, they didn't really last, sadly. So we have this story of Charlemagne, who was at a seaside town in southern Gaul. And he was enjoying his supper, and he heard about these attackers, these pirates that were at the harbor of this town. And no one knew exactly where these guys came from. Everyone was like, didn't know. But when Charlemagne took one look at their ships, he knew that they were Northmen, or Normans, basically Vikings. So he knew by looking at their ships and the speed and technique that they were using that they were Vikings. And he told his men to go chase them out of there, but they were out. Charlemagne's men were outsailed by the Normans. So yeah, that's kind of sad that happened during Charlemagne's time, and Charlemagne, as he was in the dining hall with his men, tears were spilling from his face, and he spoke to his men, and he said, "I'm not afraid that these ruffians will be able to do me any harm, but I'm horror-stricken to foresee what evil they will do to my descendants and their subjects." So this is true. Charlemagne foresaw the future where, while it may not have been that threatening for him and his kingdom, he knew that in the future, his descendants would have to deal with these Vikings, and he kind of foretold and prophesied that the Vikings would take over. And that quote is from Notker the Stammerer, who was a biographer of Charlemagne's. Okay, so then the second way that the Vikings reshaped Europe was that they changed and reshaped the map of Europe. So, many great cities were established by the Vikings. One of those was Dublin, which was established in 840. And many parts of Dublin are still connected to the Vikings today. And so one example of this that Dr. Parker gave us was the name of these 3 towns. The first one is Rathmines, Rathgar, and then Rathfarnham. And these all come from the name of one particular Viking settlement, Hrothgar. So you can see that there's a lot of Viking influence in Ireland. And also, Michael Lamorek says the Vikings were the preeminent explorers of their time, being the first to discover the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, North America, and Spitsbergen, the farthest point north that had ever been reached by explorers in 1194. So basically, these guys reshaped the map. They did a lot of settling in new places and going farther north than a lot of other explorers had gone at that time, as Michael Lamorix tells us. And then, so 1066, William the Norman, the Conqueror, comes into England and takes over. This is probably the best example of Viking influence and Viking settling that we have. William the Conqueror really transformed Europe and took away the Anglo-Saxon parts of it and replaced it with all these Viking things. And alongside with the conquering of England, also Scotland and Wales and a lot of southern parts of Europe were also conquered by the Vikings. So yeah, these guys reshaped the map by settling and establishing new kingdoms and reshaping the old ones that they found. And the third way that the Viking invasions reshaped Europe was that they transformed the Vikings and their society. They transformed Europe through their innovative technological innovation, their literature, and their trade. So we often think of the Vikings as these really violent people that just kind of plundered and raped and conquered and pillaged. But the Vikings left their dent on history primarily through their innovative ideas, which they brought to Europe. So stuff like high carbon weapons, advanced ship navigation, and the use of trade all helped Vikings spread across the globe. Another part that the Vikings influenced, or how their innovative ideas influenced culture, was through their sagas, basically their stories. And Ben Myers tells us a little bit about these stories, and he says that these stories called sagas still influence story reading and telling today. And unlike the fanatical and unbelievable stories from ancient writers like Homer, these sagas remained grounded in reality, along with adding mystical elements to it. So the storytelling that the Vikings used was part of the way they transformed Europe. And then Michael Lamorix, or however you say that French guy's name, tells us about the Viking construction. So Vikings came to York, and we can see from archaeological evidence that before the Vikings, the buildings that were in York were of post and plank construction. And after the Vikings, there were posts and timbers, and the buildings were better constructed. And Michael Lemoray tells us highly skilled and capable of producing pine blades, sometimes pattern welding, that were designed for long use. I don't know what that means. But anyway, the Vikings were technologically advanced in construction techniques for their time. So that is how they impacted Europe. So let's go back to the main thesis. Viking invasions reshaped Europe through three ways. First, they ended the Carolingian Renaissance. Second, they reshaped the European map. And third, they transformed culture by transmitting their technological innovation, their literature, and their trade.